This video is about using the Fetch Application Programming Interface, or API, in React components. Specifically, we will focus on using the fetch function to retrieve data from representational state transfer, or REST APIs. This is a modern approach to handle Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, requests and API data within React applications. The Fetch API is a modern JavaScript API designed for making HTTP requests and handling the responses. It offers several key features, including a promise-based interface, which simplifies asynchronous operations. It has built-in browser support, meaning it's readily available in most modern browsers without the need for external libraries. The Fetch API provides a cleaner and more readable syntax compared to the older XML HTTP request method. Finally, it allows for flexible request configuration, enabling you to customize your requests as needed. Here are a couple of examples to illustrate the basic syntax of the Fetch API. First, consider a simple GET request. You can use the fetch function passing in the uniform resource locator, or URL, of the API endpoint. The then method is used to handle the response, parsing it as JSON. The next then method processes the retrieved data. Additionally, the catch method is used to handle any errors that may occur during the process. Alternatively, you can use the async or await syntax to achieve the same result. Define an async function, and use the await keyword when calling the fetch function and parsing the response. This approach can make your code more readable and easier to follow. Here's how you can use the Fetch API within the useEffect hook in a React component. First, import the useState and useEffect hooks from React. Next, define a functional component called userList. Inside this component, we use the useState hook to initialize two state variables, users and loading. Users will store the data fetched from the API, and loading will indicate whether the data is still being fetched. Then, use the useEffect hook to perform the data fetching when the component mounts. Inside the useEffect, define an async function called fetchUsers. This function uses the Fetch API to retrieve data from the API endpoint/API/users. After fetching the data, it updates the user's state variable with the retrieved data and sets the loading state to false. Here's an example of how to implement error handling when using the Fetch API. Wrap the fetch call in a try-catch block to handle potential errors. Inside the try block, check if the response status is OK. If the response is not OK, throw an error with a descriptive message including the HTTP status code. If an error occurs, catch it in the catch block and set the error state variable with the error message. Finally, set the loading state to false in the finally block, regardless of whether the request was successful or not. Here's how to make post requests using the Fetch API. Define an async function called createUser that takes user data as input. Inside the function, call the Fetch API with the URL of the API endpoint. Specify the method as post in the options object. Set the content type header to application/JSON to indicate that you're sending JSON data. Include the user data in the body of the request using the JSON.stringify method. Await the response from the API and parse it as JSON. Finally, return the result. Here is an example of how to create a custom hook for fetching data. First, import useState and useEffect from React. Then define a custom hook called useFetch that accepts a URL as a parameter. Inside the hook, create three state variables: data, loading, and error, using the useState hook. Next, use the useEffect hook to fetch the data when the URL changes. Inside the useEffect, define an async function called fetchData that makes the API request using the Fetch API. After fetching the data, update the data state variable with the result and set loading to false. Finally, return an object containing the data, loading, and error state variables. Here are some best practices to keep in mind when working with the Fetch API. Always handle errors by using try-catch blocks and checking the response.OK status. Show loading states to provide feedback to the user while requests are in progress. Clean up on unmount by using abort controller to cancel ongoing requests when a component unmounts. Create reusable custom hooks to abstract common fetch patterns and promote code reuse. If you like this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Visit CodeLucky.com for more such useful content.